Hello. This message is going out to the community members in Bladen and Cumberland counties. We're sorry that we couldn't be there with you in person on March 12th. Obviously, with the COVID-19 virus, it was in everyone's best interest to cancel that meeting. But we hope that this video will help give you an update on all the work that's been ongoing since the order was finalized in February of 2019. Let me assure all the community members that the DEQ team stands ready and fully focused on implementation of the consent order and protecting the community. We've been working hard over the last year plus to do just that. That's not saying that all the work is done. Quite frankly, there's still a lot left to do. You'll hear more details about that as you hear from the different team members during this video presentation. I do invite your continued input and your continued questions. You know how to reach us here at DEQ, so as you have questions about the order, about well sampling, about anything related to the filtration systems, please reach out. We want to hear your questions. We want to try and answer them and help you to the best of our ability. I will recognize that there has been a lot of progress made in reducing PFAS, releases of PFAS into the environment. First, you may recall that in November of 2017, we required Chemours to stop the release of their processed wastewater from going into the Cape Fear River. After that, we also required well testing, trying to identify which wells in the community had been impacted by PFAS emissions from the facility, and obviously also required bottled water. In addition, there have been a lot of work on reducing the air emissions from the facility. Part of our investigation showed that air emissions were a significant part of what had caused the groundwater contamination near your homes. There's been several different types of technology that's been installed. Most recently, you've heard about the thermal oxidizer. That piece of equipment became operational in late December 2019. We're continuing to evaluate whether that equipment is in fact achieving the emission reductions that is needed and required under the consent order. So all of that is good progress, but there is obviously more work to be done. There are more wells to be tested. There are determinations to be made about community public water, and we continue to explore those questions and try and get answers every day here at DEQ. We are also looking at the existing soil and groundwater contamination. The corrective action plan that was put out was not a plan that had been reviewed by DEQ. That was simply something that had been submitted by Chemours. The agency is still in the process of reviewing that document. We wanted to have a public comment period that was laid out in the order. But obviously the purpose of the comment period is to hear from those in the community, those that are affected by soil and groundwater contamination. And we want to hear from you to understand what your concerns are and how best we need to address those concerns. So I invite you to continue to ask questions about the corrective action plan. I know this is complicated, especially for those that don't normally deal with these issues. Again, our team is here to try and help you understand those issues, try and help you understand how this work could impact you and your family as we go forward. You will hear more from Michael Scott, our Director of Division of Waste Management, on the corrective action plan and some of the concerns that our agency has. Our comment period remains open. We're evaluating whether to further extend it so that we can hopefully get to the community. Obviously, that's a balance between trying to keep work moving, that is cleaning up the PFAS contamination, and getting appropriate community input. So we are doing our best as we address the challenges of COVID-19, but we are here. We're still available via phone. I encourage you to reach out to us, call us with any questions that you have, And I encourage you to, if you have comments that you want to go ahead and submit, please submit them on the corrective action plan. I want to also assure you that this department is fully committed to the complete implementation of the consent order, and we will continue to work every day to try and protect you and those affected in your communities. Thank you for your time.
Hello, I'm Michael Scott, Director of Division of Waste Management within the Department of Environmental Quality. And today we'd like to provide an update on the Chemours site in Bladen County. There's been a lot of discussion about the particular compound GenX. As you can see on this slide, GenX or HFPO-DA for dimeracid or C3-dimeracid are some of the names that this compound is often referred to. It's actually, GenX is a trade name for a man-made and unregulated chemical used in the manufacturing of nonstick coatings and for other purposes. You may also hear the term emerging compounds. GenX is within a family of emerging compounds known as per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances, or some refer to as PFAS. It's been produced and emitted by the Chemours Company in North Carolina at the Fayetteville Works site, formerly DuPont, has been discharged, this particular compound, into the Cape Fear River for more than 30 years, either as a byproduct or an actual product from this particular location. One important thing to keep in mind is, like with a lot of emerging compounds, GenX and others like it could not be tested until the last few years, as this slide indicates. So what do we mean when we refer to this term, emerging compounds? These specific compounds have no specific limit in environmental regulations. There's often very little known about how they behave in the environment and also their effects on human health and the environment. They do present a significant challenge for the Department of Environmental Quality and other regulatory agencies. And some important questions is how we prioritize our focus on emerging compounds, what research we do to investigate them, and how we minimize the impacts to communities across our state and others that face the particular situations with emerging compounds. And most important, like we're trying to do here, how do we communicate about them? Not only what we do know, but almost more importantly, what we do not currently know about emerging compounds. When we talk specifically about GenX, the Chemours site in Bladen County, North Carolina, this timeline gives you an idea of some of the areas of focus. Early 2017 to mid 2017, there was a lot of focus on this particular compound and its presence in the Cape Fear River. Around the middle part of the year, there were specific groundwater issues that were discovered, meaning the presence of the compound not only in the river, but also in groundwater. And also, later that particular year, the potential for air emissions from the plant, for this compound actually to be found in what was emitted into the air from this particular location. In 2018, there was a host of different testing of emissions for this particular compound, and a lot of testing on private drinking water wells for the presence of this compound and in order to make informed decisions on the path forward. We'll talk some today about the very important document that was signed in February of 2019, which was the consent order that was entered into by the Department of Environmental Quality and Chemours. And we'll talk a little bit more about the specifics of that document and how important it is. In 2019, a lot of you may have heard about this new technology that was implemented at Chemours called the thermal oxidizer. It's a critical piece of equipment that has helped to eliminate the PFAS that were previously being emitted into the air emissions. 2019 to 20, we continued to see a lot of ongoing private well sampling. That well sampling has not stopped. It is still continuing to identify private residential wells that may have unfortunately been impacted by GenX and other compounds that we will talk about today. And currently, there's also a lot of focus on the residual PFAS. What is left that needs to be characterized at the Fayetteville Works site, within the river, or areas beyond the plant site itself, what we refer to as the residual PFAS, or per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances. This particular slide gives you a good illustration of the property when we talk about the Fayetteville Works site and this color-coded area, meaning the actual Chemours site, where the compound GenX and other PFAS have originated from. This is one of the very first maps we developed that shows different indications of groundwater levels of the compound GenX and some of the older PFAS referred to PFOA and PFOS, and their associated levels in groundwater in nanograms per liter, or what you may refer to as part per trillion. So the red boxes get larger as the level in groundwater increases, but it's a good illustration of the plant, its location next to the Cape Fear River on the right-hand side, and some of the very initial data that has led us to our ongoing investigation. So when we knew the levels from that previous slide in on-site groundwater, or what was under the plant, we then knew that off-site or residential groundwater testing was going to be critical. So part of this that was essential was the establishment in 2017 of the Department of Health and Human Services provisional health goal for that compound GenX. And that you'll see in the second bullet here, the 140 nanogram or part per trillion level as a provisional health goal for this particular compound in drinking water. DEQ, along with Chemours and their consultant, started testing wells adjacent to the Chemours plant. And unfortunately, we found high levels of this particular compound in residential wells that were being utilized for drinking water. That then led us to ask Chemours to test for additional wells in the area to determine the extent of contamination. And that is what is still ongoing as of today, meaning March of 2020. This particular picture shows some of the DEQ staff in the field actually testing someone's residential well. The consent order is a critical document. If you're not familiar with it, we briefly mentioned it earlier and wanted to talk a little more about it. It was a document that was signed and entered into in February of 2019, includes DEQ, Chemours, Cape Fear River Watch, and establishes specific requirements of Chemours moving forward as it relates to these emerging compounds, and especially GenX. It does require, here in the second bullet, you'll see, for Chemours to reduce air emissions, achieve maximum reductions of all PFAS contributions to the river on an accelerated basis, and also to include groundwater. There's also a requirement to notify and coordinate with downstream utilities when there's a potential of discharge of any of these compounds to the Cape Fear River. One critical piece here with the third bullet, these compounds, the wastewater discharge has been stopped from entering the Cape Fear River, and this particular requirement of the consent order requires that critical notification point forward if any future discharges were to occur. There's also additional penalties apply if Chemours fails to meet specific conditions and deadlines with the consent order. And the consent order is very clear on work products that must be produced and the timeline when they must be produced and submitted to the Department of Environmental Quality by. We have some critical plans that are currently under review. There's a lot of focus on continuing to reduce residual PFAS that's entering the Cape Fear River. As I briefly mentioned, the wastewater discharge has been stopped to the river, which was a critical achievement. The thermal oxidizer has been put in place to cut off those compounds entering into the atmosphere. There are still areas where these compounds make their way from the Chemours site to the Cape Fear River. And so there's particular components within the consent order that require an accelerated reduction of these remaining PFAS into the river. We're also looking at a critical submittal right now, the on and off site assessment of contamination. It was received in September of 2019 to the department from Chemours, and DEQ is drafting its response. Actually currently this week we're still working to finalize that document. This particular submittal describes the sampling that Chemours has done not only at the Fayetteville Works property, about a 2,000 acre parcel, but also the data they collected in surrounding communities, not just private well data, but other data like groundwater data, soil data, etc. And so DEQ is reviewing that submittal and has comments that it's drafting for Chemours regarding the submittal of it. A critical document to talk about today includes this third bullet, the Corrective Action Plan. This document is out for public comment currently. It does include critical measures that Chemours is proposing to implement to really correct the remaining or residual contamination of PFAS at the plant and beyond. So we're taking public comment on that document, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in some upcoming slides. There's also some specific requirements for toxicity studies on potential health risk. As we talk about emerging compounds, there is a lot that is not known, including specific health risk, health impacts, and these toxicity studies on potential health risk are critical. They were received a submittal on March 25th of 2019, and contract labs will be put in place to assess potential human health and environmental effects. So this is a critical piece of the consent order that's also moving forward. Talking a little more about what people call the CAP, or the Corrective Action Plan. We did receive it late 2019 per the deadline. DEQ is also currently reviewing this very lengthy document to look at what specifics of groundwater contamination and other PFAS contamination on and off site, how they may be addressed. As we've noted, we have a current comment period that's open for this particular document, and comments can be sent to this specific email address. So we do expect to take the public comments, DEQ's comments on this document, and give that feedback back to Chemours regarding what necessary changes, improvements they may need to make to this submittal prior to implementation. Some of the main areas we're currently looking at when we talk about that corrective action plan are really some areas where more data may be needed to fully understand the on and off site impact of these PFAS, or per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. Also, furthering the dialogue on the best options for remediating what PFAS still remain, and also additional information on the potential effects to receptors, whether a receptor is a surface water body, whether it's a citizen in the surrounding community, whether it's an ecological impact. More information on those potential effects are some key areas here in this slide that we're looking at as we continue to accept public comments at the same time. As far as implementing the consent order, as we've touched on before, reducing air emissions, is a critical piece. This first bullet, implementing that thermal oxidizer, meeting those reduction milestones that are required in that document we've been referring to called the consent order. Also making sure we understand the levels of PFAS in wastewater and stormwater at the facility and the required testing that'll be needed for that. We're also taking a close look at the river sediment within the Cape Fear River. What levels of PFAS are in that sediment, within the sediment in the river that may flow to drinking water intakes downstream from the Chemours plant. And also looking at new methods to fund development of testing for total organic fluorine, not only in air emissions, but also wastewater, meaning new test methods to better characterize the total amount of these compounds in different media. And media would be either soil or air emissions, or in this slide, wastewater. And also making sure that we continue to implement the drinking water compliance plan, which was submitted back in 2019, but that those specific milestones of getting people bottled water, then transitioning to filtration systems, which we'll talk more about this afternoon, are implemented correctly, and also performing additional reporting where required. So a lot of the consent order and a lot of the questions we often get center around the sampling of private wells and what are the specific steps associated with that. This slide does touch on sampling wells and providing drinking water. There's some key terms. This first bullet talks about the well step out plan and infill plan. Chemours is basically working their way out from that 2,000 acre property called the Fayetteville Works to determine where they find these PFAS compounds in groundwater that's being used for drinking water purposes. They're having to continuously work their way out. They are also required to sample a quarter mile beyond the closest well that had any PFAS levels above 10 part per trillion is the trigger. That's the PPT, or nanogram per liter level. And you'll see in an upcoming slide, a lot of that testing to the north is approximately 10 miles out from the particular Chemours property. There's also requirements for annual retesting of wells that were previously sampled once both the step out and infill plans have been completed. Once Chemours steps out to an area to find the extent or the farthest reach of these compounds in private drinking water wells, they're then required to do infill sampling or additional sampling within that area to confirm the wells that may be impacted. So those are two key terms, step out plan and infill sampling. Also, the requirement to get bottled water to people within a specific time frame, or here 3 days upon receipt of test results that exceed a limit within the consent order. And we'll talk about some of these limits a little further, but one we've already mentioned is the 140 nanogram per liter or part per trillion level for that one compound GenX. But we'll also talk about a 10 nanogram or part per trillion level and a 70 part per trillion or nanogram per liter level in the upcoming slides. So this touches on a little what I was just introducing, providing permanent drinking water supplies. Those are eligible under the consent order, and this document has a lot of specific information. I encourage you to look at it online. You can simply search it on the website, DEQ Chemours consent order, and find it. But for those private wells, those owners of private wells where the particular compound GenX has been found above the 140 part per trillion level or any applicable health advisory, those specific private well owners are eligible either for a public water line connection or whole building, whole house filtration that we refer to as, as GAC. GAC stands for Granular Activated Carbon, and we'll show some pictures of this filtration in the upcoming slides. But if that compound is found above that 140 level, then those are the two options that are in place. There is an option within the consent order if folks do decide they want to consider reverse osmosis. That is an option that we can also talk with them about, including Chemours. If they fall into the threshold where GenX is not above 140, the other compounds that I'll be referring to are also listed in the consent order within what we call Attachment C. There's a list of compounds that are required to be tested for in drinking water. If a private well is tested and any of those compounds in that Attachment C within the consent order, and those compounds fall either above the 10 part per trillion level individually, or the combined summation of them above 70 parts per trillion, then the individual who owns that private well can be eligible for 3 under the sink reverse osmosis units. So you'll hear the acronym RO, and as it states here, that stands for reverse osmosis. And we'll show a picture of these devices in an upcoming slide so you get a better understanding of it. So in summary, this slide has a lot of critical information. It's all listed in the consent order that can be found on the DEQ website, but it outlines what is required for these different levels of PFAS contamination if, unfortunately, they're found in a private well. And it's either that public water line connection, the whole house treatment, if we're talking GenX above 140, if we're not talking about that particular compound, it's the 70 part per trillion or the 10 part per trillion levels, you would be eligible for the 3 under the sink reverse osmosis units. This particular illustration we also find a lot of community members are very interested in. It shows the Chemours site, the Fayetteville Works greater property, and kind of that pinkish polygon in the center of the slide. And then it shows different polygons that are either yellow, green, or red. The red polygons are parcels or pieces of property where a private well has been tested and the level of that compound GenX is above that Health and Human Services health goal of 140 part per trillion. In those instances, those homes would be eligible for the whole house filtration, or if public water is deemed feasible, that would also be an option. The yellow polygons would be parcels where a private well has been tested, and total PFAS for the compounds that were tested are added up to be over the 70 part per trillion, or at least one of the compounds alone is above 10 part per trillion. The green polygons give us an indication of properties or parcels where a well has been sampled, and fortunately, it is non-detect for the PFAS compounds that are being tested for, required by the consent order. The circles around the plant are labeled there on the right, distances of 3 miles, 5 miles, 7 miles, and 9 miles out from the plant. And as I mentioned earlier, we do have testing out to about that 10-mile range, showing some indications of these compounds. This slide provides some summary information. I will tell you these numbers get updated on a weekly basis, so they do change fairly often. Some important references here. We've talked about the distance from the plant that the current sampling is occurring, the well collection dates that are reflected in this table take us up to January of this year. And so these numbers will be updated as we're now in March and beyond. But total number of wells tested, private drinking water wells, is over 2,300 wells have been tested. The number that have exceeded that provisional health goal for the one compound GenX would be over 204 on this slide. And those that have exceeded for the compounds tested in that attachment C, either 10 part per trillion or nanogram per liter, the same thing, or the summation of compounds above 70 is 1,700 particular residential drinking water wells. Those results that show all of the per and polyfluoroalkyl substances below 10 nanograms per liter would be 372. These properties would not trigger a filtration system or a water line because they're non-detect or very low levels. And the maximum detected concentration of that one compound GenX is currently 4,000 nanograms per liter or part per trillion in a residential drinking water well. So this is a good illustration of what we talked about a little bit earlier, that term, the step-out plan. So this is the residential private well step-out plan sampling, and it required Chemours to develop a well testing plan. They utilized this particular illustration to show the map with the 16 different sectors, and that's where they're focusing sampling and stepping out at the different intervals as the black circles show as you move your way out from the plant. The plant would be in the center of this particular slide. And it shows in the gray shaded areas, those areas that were slated for step out sampling from December 2019 through January of 2020. And you can see in the upper portions of the slide where they were stepping out to that 10-mile range that we've talked about a few times. Once the step-out sampling is done, detections that are found, infill sampling then occurs. And so the infill or light gray areas on this map show the areas that will be sampled January through April of 2020, infilling or testing the additional wells within that area, making sure that all wells that have PFAS impacts are identified. So those are two key terms we wanted to describe in this presentation: the step-out well sampling, where it's currently occurring, and the infill testing of private wells, and where that is currently occurring through April of 2020. One important thing to convey through presenting this particular slide deck, we get a lot of questions. How do I get my well sampled? How do I request additional bottled water? In this particular slide, we're describing the testing of a private drinking water well, and a lot of the calls we get are to request private well testing or to ask for additional bottled water. The first bullet point is a critical one. Please note the Chemours phone number if you don't already have it. the 910-678-1101 number is the best initial contact to request private well sampling, ask questions about additional bottled water, or just any specific questions you have. You're always welcome to call DEQ also, but it's really important to try the Chemours number initially. Please note that Parsons Environment and Infrastructure, we call them Parsons, is an independent water testing contractor for Chemours. So when we say that Chemours is doing private well water testing, what we really mean is their consultant or contractor Parsons. If you see a vehicle or an individual that represents Parsons, they should be able to show you their information that they work for this particular company, but this is the contractor that's doing the water testing for Chemours. It's also important to get your private well water tested. If we don't know the potential levels of these PFAS levels in your well, if they are present, then it's hard to make necessary next step decisions, whether bottled water is needed or filtration, or all the important aspects surrounding these particular compounds in well water. And if you refuse to have your well water tested, then there's no way to initiate next steps like we just mentioned, whether that's sending bottled water immediately, talking about the implementation of a filtration system, or even if you are eligible for a municipal water line. So it's very important to have your well tested, and if you decide to refuse well water testing, then you're not going to be eligible for some of these alternative drinking water sources. There's been a lot of discussion regarding public water or municipal water supplies, and they are options under the consent order. This particular slide talks about public water supplies where they're feasible for that compound GenX, levels that are at or above that 140 part per trillion. We have issued a letter regarding areas on the east side of the Cape Fear River. That would include Cumberland and Bladen County areas on the east side of the Cape Fear River, where we reached the decision in coordination with Bladen and Cumberland County that it just was not feasible for public water lines to be run to this area. The current water lines are too far from the areas of impact, and so these particular communities that unfortunately may have impacts from these PFAS compounds in well water will be eligible for filtration systems, as we've talked about before, either the granular activated carbon or the reverse osmosis systems. We have more recently issued a letter for Bladen County west of the river. There will be households in Bladen County on that side of the river, the west side, that will be eligible for municipal water lines. Currently it's about 60 homes where the level of GenX is above that 140 part per trillion level, and they will be eligible for water lines that are being discussed right now between Chemours and Bladen County. We have an ongoing dialogue with Cumberland County about specific residences west of the Cape Fear River in that county, and the recent commitment about the county to run municipal water. So Cumberland County has come forward, as a lot of you may know, with their specific initiatives to try to get public water to this area west of the river. So we are in communication with both the county and Chemours on those necessary next steps. One thing that's important to know is that DEQ has been testing these filtration systems. So when we talk about the whole house granular activated carbon sites, this picture in the upper right hand corner shows you what these particular systems look like. They have an iron and sediment filter, the small cartridges on the left. They can have 2 carbon canisters that literally filter out these particular PFAS compounds if they're present in drinking water. So these particular sites that have the granular activated carbon would be systems where that GenX compound was found above 140 part per trillion. We have tested them to see if they're effective at removing not only GenX, but those other compounds that were identified in the consent order, attachment C, if they effectively remove them. But also what maintenance and monitoring is required. So as you can think about, your automobile requires different service, maybe your refrigerator has a filter on it that is required to be replaced. These systems also require maintenance. So part of the Department of Environmental Quality study was to evaluate not only the effectiveness, but what maintenance would be required for these systems. We looked at 6 locations where these granular activated whole house systems were installed. The average GenX level in the untreated well water went from 178 to over 1,700 parts per trillion. You can see the water usage that was used in these homes between 500 and 2,000 gallons per week. And we not only analyzed for GenX, but 32 other of the PFAS compounds. Please note that not all of these systems are created equal. So if you were to decide to buy one on your own or look at one on your own, just make sure that you know that not all systems are equal. We were testing the specific granular activated carbon systems that Chemours has agreed to apply to the communities around the Chemours site in Bladen County. This particular graph has a lot of data on it, but I just wanted to show you the testing that we've done over time. This is at one site where DEQ's tested the whole house granular activated carbon, and we call it location 75. It's just a number we use to refer to this particular address. And you can see the data is from May of 2018 through April of 2019. It shows you in red the total level of these PFAS compounds in the water that's coming from the ground that the well is pumping up. And then the blue line shows you what is treated when it comes through the filter cartridges. And you can see that some of these levels in part per trillion are in the 3,000 range, 2,000 range. But once it's treated by this activated carbon system, that blue line is essentially zero on most of the sampling dates. There's a few indications of low levels of the compounds, but the main message is the GAC systems are very effective in filtering out the compounds. The red line up and down shows when the canisters were replaced or switched out. As I mentioned, it's very important to understand that these systems have to be maintained. Chemours not only pays for the installation, they also pay for the ongoing maintenance of the system for 20 years. So when it comes to maintenance of these granular activated carbon systems, like I've stated, they do need to be maintained. The consent order requires testing between those two blue canisters that we showed in the slide to make sure a compound doesn't make it through the first filter, through the second filter, and then into the home. They're tested between those two blue cylinders to make sure the system is adequately serviced and none of these compounds make their way into the home in the drinking water supply. And they must be changed, the filters, whenever any PFAS reaches 100 part per trillion between the filters. And so you've still got that second filter to make sure nothing's entering the house, but this is the trigger point for servicing. And if they're not changed regularly, they can be a source of increased levels of PFAS in the water that could make it into the home. And that's why we want to make sure we're very clear on these service intervals. But I want to be very clear that Chemours is also responsible for making sure that service is done appropriately, but DEQ is making sure we're monitoring the service intervals. So we've also conducted a pilot study, we call it DEQ, on the other filters that are offered. These are called RO, which stands for reverse osmosis. The difference that a lot of you already know is that the ROs are installed under the sink or in the house in most instances. They can be also installed in the crawl space or under a home, but they do not filter the entire home's water supply. They filter what is going into a particular sink, like the kitchen sink, or a particular bathroom. But we have tested these systems, even though Chemours has said they're effective, the scientific literature says they're effective. DEQ is conducting testing to ensure their effectiveness. So that was a question we had. We want to make sure what's being offered is effective and effective in Bladen, Cumberland, Robeson County, North Carolina. So low concentrations of these compounds are typically eligible for RO. Higher concentrations of the GenX compound we've already talked about today are eligible for the whole house or granular activated carbon system. So our study has looked at 4 locations where reverse osmosis systems have been installed. You can see the average level of PFAS in the well water goes from 101 to 155 part per trillion. We have instances of up to 7 different PFAS compounds being detected in the water. And we have one home that has a very high concentration of PFAS of 3,300 part per trillion. and it's also being tested and has 18 total compounds in its well water. And we're looking at GenX and about 40 other PFAS in this particular pilot study. Please note, like we've stated before, if you were to go online or to a local store and look at different systems, we are testing for what Chemours is offering in the surrounding communities, which are systems made by Connecticut. This particular graph is for those specific under the sink systems called reverse osmosis. And you can see that this data was collected from July of 2019 through December of last year. And you can see that the red line shows the untreated water, which range from about 93 part per trillion PFAS up to 124 or so part per trillion. But once the water made its way through the reverse osmosis treatment system, you can see that on every sample date we tested this particular location, location 179, that it was zero amount of PFAS in the finished water, or what someone would be drinking, what someone would be making coffee with. The systems are very effective in removing the PFAS. And we do have additional information that can be found about these systems on our website. This particular location just shares some additional information from a second of one of the locations, a second location where we're conducting the pilot study. You can see that these are higher levels of PFAS, 3,000 part per trillion, 4,000 part per trillion on the red line, but the blue line stays pretty much the same. It's 0, 0, very low detection, 3 part per trillion in September of 2019, and then further non-detects or zeros, showing how effective these reverse osmosis systems are in removing, even if there are higher levels in the thousands of PFAS, unfortunately, in a residential drinking water supply. So just a few final pieces of information on the reverse osmosis systems. This is a close-up of what it looks like under a sink area. You can see the white plumbing pipes for the sink and then the reverse osmosis units themselves. They do generate up to 50 gallons of water a day. They can view an indicator on the system that will drop, as you see this little white bar, the left compared to the right, as the filter within this unit reaches its end of life. They will stop working when that filter is depleted, so we're closely monitoring when they need to be serviced. Chemours is working with the vendor, Connecticut, to also make sure they're serviced appropriately. But it's the same message. These systems are effective, but they do require maintenance, but the maintenance and the cost associated with installing them and maintaining them is covered by Chemours. So we have a lot of information when it comes to the Department of Environmental Quality regarding the Chemours site and information for the surrounding communities. We have started sending out every couple of months or so a community update where we talk about what's going on with our Division of Air Quality, what is the Division of Waste Management working on when it comes to groundwater aspects or drinking water supplies, what's going on with it when it comes to the Division of Water Resources. So this is a great opportunity to get very recent updates, and we're also loading information on a new site which we call the residents page, where we'll supply additional information, try to address a lot of the questions that the community has as the well sampling continues, as we look at very important documents like the Corrective Action Plan, and as we try to just disseminate as much information as possible regarding this particular site. So this is my contact information here within the Division of Waste Management, and thank you for listening to these particular points today, and please reach out to us with any questions. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Michael Pagetra. I'm the Deputy Director with the North Carolina Division of Air Quality, and I'm going to speak to you today about the air quality update on the Chemours order. This first slide contains a website that you can access that will contain all the air quality information, including the consent order, links to the air permit, surrounding information about the air permit, as well as links to all the source testing that's been performed and a PDF of every test that's been performed for the past 2 years at the facility. This is a snapshot of all the testing that the Division of Air Quality has required Chemours to complete. All the source testing has been used in order to estimate the amount of GenX that has been emitted from the facility, as well as to calculate the reductions in GenX emissions over the past year. DAQ required actions in the consent order. These are the things that we have required Chemours to complete through the application of the consent order. First is the control technology improvements. All the emissions from the vinyl ethers north are routed through the division waste scrubber, and then the second phase scrubber, and then a carbon absorber. A second phase scrubber was required to be added to the division waste gas scrubber, and that was completed in November of 2018. The carbon absorber project was completed on December 26 of 2018. They're required to test to demonstrate that the carbon absorber control efficiency was 93% for GenX, and that was also completed. The thermal oxidizer was really the crux of the consent order for the purposes of air emissions control. By December 31st, 2019, the facility was required to control all PFAS emissions that were routed to the thermal oxidizer by 99.99%. Chemours was required to test and submit a report demonstrating that percentage 90 days after the December 31st deadline. The thermal oxidizer was installed and operational on December 27th, 2019, and testing for the 99.99% control efficiency was completed in February of 2020. The DAQ is awaiting the final test report that's due by March 30th of 2020. The Division of Air Quality has had staff on site for every test that's occurred, whether it be during the work week, on weekends, during holidays, or at night. So let's cover some of the GenX emission reduction requirements. In the order between October 6, 2018 and October 5th of 2019, the facility was required to reduce their GenX emissions by 82%. And they were required to submit a final report to the DAQ documenting that reduction. All the source testing that I mentioned earlier and the list of tests that they completed were used in order to calculate those reductions in emissions from a 2017 baseline. Chemours submitted the report on November 20th, 2019, and the reported annual reduction was 88% from the 2017 baseline. The DAQ continues to review that report as we evaluate all of the data associated with it. Another requirement in the order was a reduction of GenX emissions of 92% between the time period of December 31st, 2018 to December 30th, 2019. The facility was required to submit a report by February 28th of 2020. That report was submitted on January 21st, and they reported an annual reduction of 92% from the 2017 baseline. Again, the DAQ continues to review the report and the underlying data based on all the source testing that's been submitted. The crux of the order is in the GenX reduction milestones was by December 31st, 2019, and for each consecutive 12-month period following that date, Chemours shall reduce facility-wide annual air emissions of GenX compounds by at least 99% through testing and reporting. DAQ will continue to require testing and reporting into the future on this condition. So once we have a full annual year, once we get into 2021, we'll get the report for calendar year 2020, which has to demonstrate the 99% reduction. These are some contact information. Again, my name is Michael Pietra. I'm the Deputy Director with the Division of Air Quality, and the contact information for the Director, Mike Abrazinskis, is listed as well. Thank you very much.